Control to Compassion, a Buddha reflection. I used to believe control was strength, that if I held things tightly enough, life would finally feel stable. But the more I tried to manage everything, the more restless I became, as if something inside me was quietly resisting my grip. There came a moment when I began to notice this tension, not as a problem to fix, but as something to understand. And in that simple shift, I started to see what the Buddha once pointed toward. That peace does not come from controlling life, but from seeing it clearly. This is where the change began for me, not by forcing anything to be different, but by learning how to soften, and in that softening, something deeper started to open. The quiet tightening. There is a moment you recognize, perhaps not immediately, but somewhere in the body, where something tightens without asking permission. It happens when someone behaves differently than you expected, when you remember something you wish had gone another way, or when life refuses to follow the quiet plan you had arranged inside your mind. And in that tightening, you feel a subtle urge to correct, to reshape, to make things align again. You may not call it control. It feels more reasonable than that. It feels like clarity, like knowing how things should be. But if you sit with it gently, the way the Buddha once invited his listeners to sit with their own experience, you begin to notice that this tightening carries strain. It asks life to rewind, to adjust, to behave differently than it does. And in that asking, something inside you resists what is already here. So you begin here, not by fixing it, but by seeing it. Noticing how expectation forms quietly, and how, just as quietly, it begins to harden. The weight of should. As you move through your day, you may hear a silent language running beneath your thoughts. It speaks in quiet instructions. This should not have happened. They should understand. I should be better than this by now. These sentences feel harmless, even necessary, yet each one carries a hidden pressure. The Buddha did not ask you to remove this voice by force. Instead, he pointed towards seeing its effect. When you follow these shoulds, the present moment begins to feel insufficient. What is happening becomes secondary to what you believe should be happening. And slowly, dissatisfaction grows, not because life is failing, but because expectation is narrowing your view. It is like holding a rigid frame over a moving landscape. The more the landscape shifts, the more tension you feel trying to keep it aligned. And eventually, you begin to sense that the strain is not coming from life itself, but from the insistence that it must fit your frame. When compassion freezes. When the heart cannot move, it is not because it is empty, but because it is held too tightly. There are moments when compassion feels distant, even toward those you care about, even toward yourself. You may notice irritation where understanding could have been, judgment where softness might have appeared. And beneath that, often unnoticed, is expectation. The Buddha's way of seeing reveals something subtle here. Compassion does not disappear. It becomes blocked. Like water behind a closed gate, it remains present, but unable to flow. Expectation closes that gate. It says, they should be different. I should have known better. This should not be happening. And so compassion freezes into resentment, into frustration, into quiet hardness. But when you soften the expectation, even slightly, something begins to move again. Not as effort, not as obligation, but as a natural response. You begin to see not just behavior, but the conditions behind it. And in that seeing, compassion finds its path again. The space of not knowing. There is a discomfort in not having clear answers. The mind prefers resolution. It wants to label quickly, to decide who is right, what is wrong, and how things should proceed. This gives a sense of stability, a sense of control. But the Buddha often pointed in another direction, toward a kind of seeing that allows uncertainty to exist. When you do not rush to conclusions, perception opens. You begin to notice details that certainty would have ignored. The tone behind someone's words, the fatigue beneath their reaction, the fear hidden inside anger. This does not make life simpler. It makes it more accurate. And within that accuracy, something softens. You no longer need immediate answers in order to remain present. You can stay with what is unfolding, even when it is unclear. And in that staying, understanding deepens naturally, without force. The return to the body. When control tightens, it often pulls you into the mind. You begin analyzing, evaluating, constructing explanations. This can feel productive, but it also creates distance from something essential, the body. The Buddha's teaching quietly returns you here, not as a technique, but as a recognition. When you notice sensation, the breath, the subtle movements within, you begin to reconnect with direct experience. And in that contact, something shifts. You feel the tension rather than just thinking about it. You feel the contraction of expectation, the heaviness of resistance. And this feeling is not a problem. It is information. It shows you where holding is happening. And as you stay with it, gently, without trying to remove it, the grip begins to loosen on its own. The softening of judgment. Seeing clearly does not divide the world into good and bad. It reveals conditions and how they move. Judgment simplifies. It creates clear categories, right and wrong, strong and weak, responsible and careless. And for a moment, this simplicity feels satisfying. It gives the illusion of understanding. But as the Buddha's way of seeing deepens within you, something begins to change. You start to notice how incomplete these categories are. A person can act harmfully and still be suffering deeply. You can make a mistake and still be learning. This does not remove responsibility. It expands context. And within that expanded view, judgment begins to soften. Not because you are forcing kindness, but because you are seeing more fully. And when perception becomes more complete, your response naturally becomes more balanced, less reactive, more grounded. Conflict without winning. In moments of conflict, control becomes especially strong. There is a desire to be understood, to be right, to bring the situation to a clear resolution. And often, this leads to escalation rather than clarity. The Buddha's insight introduces a quiet shift here. Instead of focusing on winning, you begin to notice suffering on both sides. Not as a concept, but as a lived reality. You feel your own tension, your own need to be heard. And you begin to sense the same tension in the other. This does not mean agreement. It does not mean abandoning your position. But it changes how you hold it. You no longer need to defeat the other person in order to stand where you stand. And in that shift, something unexpected happens. The conversation becomes less rigid, less defensive, more open. Not always resolved, but less harmful. The illusion of inner control. As you continue observing, a more subtle pattern appears. You begin to notice how you try to control not only situations, but your own inner experience. You try to feel calm, to stay composed, to maintain a certain state. This often appears as discipline, even as wisdom, but the Buddha's way of seeing reveals something deeper. When you try to control your inner world, you create a division. There is the one who controls, and the experience being controlled, and this division creates tension. True presence does not control experience. It allows it. This does not mean becoming overwhelmed. It means staying in contact, feeling anger without becoming anger, noticing sadness without pushing it away, and in that contact, experience begins to move naturally, without force. When practice becomes identity. Even the path, when held tightly, becomes another place to stand. There is a moment in practice where understanding grows. You become more aware, more steady, more reflective, and with this growth, a subtle shift can occur. You begin to see yourself as someone who understands. This is where control becomes refined. It no longer looks harsh. It looks calm, composed, even wise. But beneath it, there may still be a quiet need to maintain that image. To remain the one who knows, who is stable, who is beyond confusion. The Buddhist teaching gently dissolves this, not by rejecting growth, but by removing ownership from it. Insight is not something you become. It is something that appears and disappears. And when you see this clearly, identity loosens. You no longer need to be a certain way in order to feel secure. The return of curiosity. When control softens, something simple returns. Curiosity, not as a technique, but as a natural openness. You begin to ask, what is this like, rather than, why is this wrong? This shift changes everything quietly. You start to explore experience rather than judge it. You listen more carefully. You observe more gently. And in this curiosity, perception becomes more detailed, more alive. The Buddha's way of seeing is not rigid. It is deeply curious. It looks again and again, without assuming it already knows. And as you begin to embody this, you notice how much becomes visible that was previously hidden by certainty. The pressure of time. There is another form of control that hides in plain sight. The sense that things should happen on time. That growth should follow a schedule. That healing should be complete by now. This creates a constant pressure, a quiet urgency that sits beneath your actions. You begin to measure yourself against imagined timelines, and when reality does not match, frustration appears. But the Buddha's insight reveals something fundamental. Life does not unfold according to your internal deadlines. It moves according to conditions. Like a seed growing in its own season, change happens when it is ready, not when it is demanded. And when you begin to see this clearly, the pressure of time softens. You are still moving, still learning, but without the constant sense of being behind. The patience that is not waiting. Patience is not the endurance of time. It is the absence of resistance to this moment. Patience is often misunderstood as waiting for something better, but this kind of waiting carries tension. It holds the present as something incomplete. The Buddha's understanding points to something different. Patience as presence. Being fully here, without needing the moment to become something else. This kind of patience is not passive. It is deeply attentive. It notices subtle changes, small movements, quiet shifts that urgency would overlook. And in this noticing, trust begins to grow, not as belief, but as lived experience. The end of comparison. Comparison feeds control. It tells you where you stand, how far you have come, how far you still need to go. And while it can seem motivating, it often creates dissatisfaction. As your seeing deepens, you begin to recognize something simple. You do not experience life through anyone else's path. You experience it here, in this body, in this moment. This is what Buddha pointed toward, a way of seeing that frees you from measuring life against anything outside of direct experience. And when you return fully to that, comparison begins to lose its hold. Not because you reject it, but because it becomes irrelevant. Your attention is no longer divided. It is grounded, and in that grounding, a quiet contentment appears. The gentle intelligence of letting go. Control often feels like strength. It gives the sense that you are managing life, directing it, keeping it in order. But as you observe more closely, you begin to see its cost. The tension, the rigidity, the constant effort. Letting go, in contrast, may initially feel uncertain. But within it, there is a different kind of intelligence. One that responds rather than forces. One that adapts rather than resists. The Buddhist teaching does not remove action. It refines it. Action becomes aligned with what is present rather than driven by what should be. And in that alignment, effort becomes lighter, more precise, less exhausting. The freedom of clear seeing. There is a quiet kind of freedom that does not come from changing the world, but from seeing it without distortion, something Buddha gently pointed toward. In this seeing, you begin to notice that control was never truly holding life together. It was holding tension in place, creating the illusion of stability while quietly tightening your experience. And as that tension begins to soften, something unexpected reveals itself. Life does not fall apart. It opens. It becomes more fluid, more responsive, more real than before. You start to trust your ability to meet what arises, not because everything is resolved, but because resistance is no longer your first movement. There is a natural willingness to be present with whatever unfolds. Uncertainty still exists. Change continues. Difficulty has not disappeared. But now there is space. Space to feel without being overwhelmed. Space to respond without force. Space to understand without rushing. Within that space, a quiet freedom begins to emerge. Not something dramatic, not a final arrival, but something steady and deeply grounding. A freedom that does not depend on shaping life into a preferred form, but on seeing clearly and moving gently with what is. This is Buddha Reflections, where philosophy, insight, and lived experience meet to explore mind, impermanence, and release. Thanks for your time. It's been a delight. What should we explore next? Comment, share, and save your insight. Subscribe to Orbital Dharma and keep your thoughts bright.